Hello and welcome to this class on the Great Depression. In the modern era, the Great Depression was the most severe financial crisis and economic downturn in the United States and most of the Western world. We will examine how financial conditions evolved during the Great Depression. We will see the massive number of bank failures. We will understand why the Federal Reserve System was ineffective at stopping the banking panic. Last, we will examine the large-scale government response that kick-started the economy and restored confidence in the banking sector. This included government spending programs. It also included the creation of new institutions such as deposit insurance. Understanding these historical episodes can be enjoyable and highly informative. Please do not worry about the precise historical details. I will mention many details, but these are mostly for fun. Focus on the narrative and what we can learn. The Great Depression is interesting because most policies that would mitigate the effects of a financial crisis, such as deposit insurance or unemployment benefits, did not exist in the US. This helps us to understand what would happen in an economy if the government did not intervene during a financial crisis. Let's start by briefly summarizing the start of the Great Depression. On October 24, 1929, the so-called Black Thursday, the market lost 11% on the opening bell. The crash followed a drop of the London Stock Exchange caused by fraud allegations against large investors. On October 28, 1929, more and more investors faced margin calls on stocks bought on credit due to dropping stock prices. As a result, more investors sold their shares and cut their losses. The Dow lost almost 13% that day. The next day, investors traded a record number of shares. 16 million shares changed hands on a single day. The next day, the stock market showed signs of illiquidity. Some stocks could not be sold at any price. The Dow lost another 12%. The chart shows the Dow Jones Industrial Stock Price Index. As you can see, the developments over October 1929 were just the prelude to a long decline in stock prices. From September 1929 to July 1932, stock prices dropped by over 80%. When the crisis began, over 8,000 commercial banks belonged to the Federal Reserve System, but nearly 16,000 did not. At the time, banks often owned stocks themselves and had limited cash reserves, so not having access to the Federal Reserve System for cash was problematic. Banks without access to the Federal Reserve often deposited cash with other larger banks, creating the potential for contagion in case small banks withdrew their deposits from large banks or large banks themselves ran into difficulties. In this environment, depositors naturally wondered about the soundness of banks. A perhaps surprising feature of the Great Depression is that there was not one national bank panic, but a large number of local bank runs. In total, about 9,000 banks closed their doors between 1929 and 1933. The large number of bank closures sharply reduced deposits. Banks, in turn, tried to shore up their cash reserves and reduced lending, and as a result, the money supply shrank. You may wonder why the Federal Reserve did not just increase the money supply. At this time, the United States, as most other nations, was on the gold standard, meaning that money was pegged to gold at a fixed exchange rate. That severely limited the central bank's options. Lower money supply put downwards pressure on prices. In this chart, we can see that consumer prices deflated by about 25% during the Great Depression. The decline was even more pronounced for food. This deflation meant that farmers and firms faced higher debt in real terms, meaning in terms of goods produced. As a result, many farmers and businesses went into bankruptcy. These bankruptcy would cause additional stress in the banking system. Lower prices, and especially expected lower prices in the future, reduce the incentives to invest. If holding cash means that you can buy more tomorrow in terms of goods, why invest the cash in a risky business endeavor that can only charge low prices in the future? With deflation setting in and less credit being available, business investment plummeted. The reduction in investment, together with the large number of bankruptcies, led to a prolonged decline in industrial production. As you can see in this chart, industrial output dropped by 50% during the Great Depression. This was an unprecedented drop in economic activity. With the economy contracting, unemployment rose fast. In this chart, you see the unemployment rate increased from virtually zero at the beginning of the Depression to over 25% by the end of the Depression. Poverty and social unrest followed as unemployment insurance did not exist. One of the most prominent examples of social unrest was the World War I Veterans March. In 1932, the jobless World War I veterans organized a group called the Bonus Expeditionary Forces to march on Washington, D.C. An estimated 20,000 veterans converged on the nation's capital and camped in Washington, D.C., demanding a bonus payment that had been promised but had stalled in Congress. The protest was eventually broken up by force, but the pictures of tanks dispersing hungry veterans weakened President Hoover's re-election bid. In November, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's campaign on economic populism won the election, and the veteran bonus was eventually paid in 1936. One of the first actions of Roosevelt after being sworn in was to declare a bank holiday, or more precisely, a bank holiday week on March 6, 1933. For an entire week, nobody had access to banks or banking services. That meant that no money could be withdrawn or transferred, and arrested bank runs that had started again earlier that year. The purpose of the bank holiday was to buy time to enact legislation that would restore confidence in the banking system and thereby prevent future runs. The Emergency Banking Act of 1933 achieved this goal. In short, the act would ensure that only banks in good condition would reopen and banks in poor conditions would be shut down. Moreover, the act gave the Federal Reserve more authority and made it easier to lend to banks. The Federal Reserve became effectively the guarantor of deposits of reopened banks. The results were immediately visible. After the act passed, the Dow Jones Industrial Stock Price Index gained over 15% in one day, and bank runs ceased. The Banking Act of 1933, also called the Glass-Steagall Act, added protections for depositors in June 1933. By separating commercial, meaning deposit taking, and investment banking, depositors were no longer exposed to banks' risk taking in stock or more generally securities markets. The Act also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, providing some insurance for deposits, which helped to prevent further runs. The Banking Act also increased bank supervision and altered some features of the Federal Reserve System. While the banking panic was over, the real economy was still in dire straits. As part of the New Deal that fundamentally reshaped the role of government in economic crisis, Roosevelt's first objective was to alleviate the suffering of unemployed workers. The government created jobs through the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Works Progress Administration gave some 8.5 million people jobs, mostly in construction. More than 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, 75,000 bridges, and 8,000 parks were built. The Civilian Conservation Corps provided work that included planting trees, building flood barriers, fighting forest fires, and maintaining forest roads. It is important to note that these projects could be started on short notice and had immediate effects. The chart shows you that unemployment dropped by 9 percentage points within a year. The economic plight of people had also shown the need for a social safety net. The creation of a pension system through the Social Security Administration, unemployment benefits, and disability benefits were part of the New Deal. The New Deal also restructured labor relations by creating the National Labor Relations Board. The economy seemed to be on track again. However, the New Deal needed to be financed and taxes increased. Moreover, with the improvements in the economy, the fiscal stimulus was withdrawn. At the same time, the Federal Reserve increased reserve requirements for banks, thereby reducing the availability of credit. In other words, contractionary monetary and fiscal policy hit the economy at the same time in 1937. You can see the result in the chart. Industrial production collapsed again in 1937. The recession ended when the Federal Reserve reduced reserve requirements. The 1937 episode provides a cautionary tale against withdrawing economic support too early. The recovery was swift. As you can see in this chart, unemployment dropped fast after the 1937 recession. However, it is important to note that another stimulus helped the economy to grow so fast: the defense build-up in Europe and the subsequent increase in government spending. You can see that starting mid-1940, the reduction in unemployment accelerated. What have we learned in this lesson? First, using the Great Depression as a case study of the consequences of financial crisis, we saw that the effects can be devastating, especially in the absence of a social safety net or government interventions. Second, only large-scale changes to the financial system can restore the confidence in the financial system. Third, the recession of 1977 illustrates that providing too little or withdrawing government support for the economy too early may result in another economic slowdown.